This is another one of our famous Avenues to Wellness Speaker Series events, and they're held on the first Tuesday night of each month. I'd like to introduce tonight's speaker, which we're really happy to have here, Annie Dogali. And Annie works at the hospital. She is a certified diabetes educator, and she is a wealth of knowledge.
I'm very excited to be here tonight and to talk about an important topic, of course, I feel.
How we can prevent hearing those words, you have diabetes. So I see a lot of familiar faces in this room. I know a lot of us are dealing with diabetes, myself included. And if you're not dealing with diabetes, I'm sure a lot of you have friends or close family members that are having to watch their blood sugars. So that's what we're talking about tonight is if you haven't heard those words, how we kind of keep you out of the diabetes woods. And if you are currently trying to manage those blood sugars, how we can do it through primarily lifestyle changes. So that's where we're going tonight. I always welcome questions, so feel free to stop me as we're going through the presentation. If you have questions, comments, a quick story to share about your own diabetes or diabetes prevention. So this is all about stopping the diabetes train by getting on the train towards diabetes prevention, and again, how we can do that through living a healthier lifestyle. So first off, I'm sure a lot of you have an understanding of what diabetes is, but there's been a lot of confusion recently as we have more research coming out. We're learning that there's more than just a couple different types of diabetes. So this is a very generic description of diabetes. It is a chronic disease where the body is unable to use blood sugar or blood glucose for energy. So all of our bodies rely on sugar. We need some sugar. We have sugar that's running through our bloodstream. And when everything's working correctly, that sugar, if we pretend that this little purple block is sugar, when things are working right, that sugar is able to get out of the bloodstream here and into the cells. And it literally feeds our cells and helps our muscles work, our heartbeat, helps keep us going day in, day out. With diabetes, because of a number of different factors, that sugar, unfortunately, is stuck out here in the bloodstream. It can't get in that cell. And either there's something wrong with the cell where the cell just doesn't want to open up and let the sugar in, or there's just such this huge, abundant amount of sugar outside in the bloodstream that even if some gets in, we're still not getting enough in to get that blood sugar level to a healthy range. So all of those factors take part in the diagnosis of diabetes.
When you measure blood sugar, you're measuring blood sugar in the bloodstream.
Yes.
Can you measure it in the cells?
You can't measure the amount of blood in the cells, but you have a great question. You can actually measure one of our best indicators for diabetes risk and how well controlled your diabetes is currently is something called hemoglobin A1C. And we're measuring if your red blood cells are like a donut. That's my little donut guy here. Sugar accumulates on the outside of the red blood cells, and you're actually measuring kind of how glazed your donuts or your red blood cells are. And that's one of our best indicators. It's called hemoglobin A1C. We'll talk about it in a moment here. But the higher you have that glaze you have, the higher percentage your A1C number is, and the greater at risk you are of prediabetes or diabetes or uncontrolled diabetes.
So how do you know when it gets in, when it's blocked from the cell? I mean, how do you know if you can't measure how much sugar's in the cell? Then how do you know?
When you have large amounts out in your bloodstream, so through, and we'll talk about that in a second too, great questions though, either by doing a finger prick or doing a fasting blood draw annually is what we recommend to see if you're at risk, and we'll talk about what the numbers are. Yeah, great questions, thank you. Some causes of high blood sugar. This is where we jump into our pancreas. Our pancreas is this amazing organ. It's actually kind of the size of a finger in our abdomen. And the pancreas has a lot of different functions, but one of its great functions for diabetes prevention and diabetes control is that it has these little beta cells and produces insulin. So when the pancreas isn't working efficiently, or if there's been destruction to these beta cells, we start to get issues with blood sugar. Another issue that can happen is the cells, like we were talking about. We've got the pancreas pumping insulin out, but the cells just aren't responding. A lot of times the cells don't respond when we have extra fat accumulated around the cells, either through a high-fat diet or through extra fat around our midsection. So that's why you'll notice one of the risk factors for diabetes is being overweight. We have extra fat on our bodies, we have extra fat around our cells, and that insulin can't talk to the cell. And then, of course, we can have a combination of both of these factors going on. So the numbers, we just had a great question about that hemoglobin A1C, that blood test that literally measures that level of sugar attached to the red blood cells. If your hemoglobin A1C is at or above 6.5, that's a diagnosis of diabetes. So this is something where, especially if you have a strong family history of diabetes, if you haven't had an A1C level drawn, I highly recommend it. It's how my own diabetes was diagnosed. I had had fasting sugars that were fine, felt fine, until I had an A1C drawn. Had no idea that I was in the prediabetes range. So I highly encourage it if you have any risk factors to ask your physician for the A1C. Now, fasting blood glucose, if everything else is normal and say you just go in annually for a physical, I'd encourage you to have a fasting blood panel done annually that includes a fasting blood glucose. If we're above 126, it's a diabetes diagnosis. And this is rarely done outside of pregnancy, so I'm just going to talk about it briefly, but if you ever had a glucose tolerance test where you actually drink a large amount of sugar and then they test your blood sugar, if it's above 200, we have a diagnosis. Anytime during the day, say you were feeling sick, you went to the emergency department, they did a spot check on your blood sugar, you had never been diagnosed with diabetes before, if that random blood sugar is ever above 200, and especially if you have other symptoms, you're thirsty all the time, you're urinating a lot more frequently, that's also a diagnosis of diabetes. So kind of be aware of those numbers. I really encourage you to be proactive in talking to your physicians about checking those numbers if you haven't had them checked recently. Now, prediabetes. This is where, of course, our numbers are a little bit lower, but we're still in the risk zone. We've still got something going on with the cells or with our pancreas. And this would be that fasting blood sugar 100 to 125. This would be that post-glucose tolerance test 140 to 199, and then that A1C, that kind of more definitive test, 5.7 to 6.4. The bottom line is if you don't know if you're at risk for diabetes, and especially if you have a strong family history, ask your physician to test your risk, especially with that A1C value. How do we manage it? How do we prevent ourselves from getting those numbers that high to where we're in the prediabetes or diabetes range? Of course, I'm biased being a registered dietitian, but food really is preventative medicine when it comes to keeping us out of the diabetes woods. And it doesn't have to be rocket science. It doesn't have to be signing up for Nutrisystem's diabetes program or having a specialized meal plan, mapped out for you. There's some simple steps that we can take, some changes we can take to meals and snacks each day where daily and even meal by meal we're preventing diabetes. And that's what tonight's talk is all about. So this is our common sense guide to eating. And I want to reiterate that the things we're talking about this evening are not just for diabetes prevention or if you already have diabetes. These are healthy eating guidelines for everybody. And I encourage people that if people in this room have diabetes and you're dealing with friends or family members that maybe are telling you, tisk tisk, you shouldn't be eating that, or you should be eating this, or tell people that the healthy diet that you're trying to follow, that's the healthy diet everybody should be following. So if you've got somebody that's eating a cookie and telling you can't do the same thing, is encourage them, hey, you should be on board with this too. But also, we'll talk about this in a minute, things like cookies aren't an absolute no-no when it comes to diabetes prevention. There's room for even some of our sweets, some of our goodies, but it's that everything in moderation. And if there's one kind of evil food or evil food category that we want to watch out for diabetes, it's our highly processed foods. So just think about that. If we can stay out of the packages and out of the boxes, we're doing our bodies good. 2 basic eating strategies when it comes to diabetes prevention. The first one is, if you are in that overweight category, is losing some weight. Doesn't have to be a huge amount. We're talking as little as 5% of your current weight if you're overweight. For a lot of people, that might be just 8 pounds, 10 pounds, 12 pounds, which is doable. It's a reasonable weight loss. If we lose weight, automatically that insulin can work better in the body. We make the pancreas happy. Our blood pressure goes down. Our blood sugars go down. Cholesterol levels come down. And if we have a family history of heart disease or stroke, we reduce that risk by losing weight. The other part of the diabetes prevention diet is the heart-healthy piece. So you may have heard from your doctors, oh, we want to watch sodium, we want to watch fat, we want to watch cholesterol. If you've been diagnosed with prediabetes or diabetes, we want to listen to that even more so, because elevated blood sugars and heart disease go hand in hand. And the majority of people that are passing away from diabetes complications are passing away from heart disease. So think about that. If you currently have a diabetes diagnosis or a friend or a family member that does, we've got to watch out for our heart. Those of you maybe that are already following a heart-healthy diet or that have talked to friends or family or your physician about being heart-healthy, what's something that comes into mind as far as healthy foods or healthy ingredients to make our heart happy? Anybody want to share?
Fruits and vegetables.
Fruits and vegetables, absolutely. Absolutely. So fruits and vegetables are a great one. So more fiber is what we're getting from fruits and vegetables. They lower our cholesterol. We feel fuller on fewer calories, so helps with that weight loss. Another thing is low-fat foods. Fruits and vegetables that were just mentioned are nice and low in fat. So by eating less fat, especially the bad types of fat, we're automatically cutting calories out, we're bringing cholesterol down, and we're further reducing our risk of heart attack and stroke. So those restaurants in town that we were just talking about that have the low fat, low sodium, low calorie options, not a bad idea at all, because automatically we're following some of these heart healthy guidelines while still having a nice, enjoyable meal out. We were just talking about this, but really watching the refined and the processed foods. Okay, and some take-home messages here are, when we're looking at our packaged foods, is how many ingredients are on there? Can we even recognize the foods that are on the label? I'm going to pass around just some of my little packages here, and if we have time in a moment, we'll share just some of the ingredients and see if we have a food that's going to be a happy blood sugar food or not.
How does oatmeal fit into the picture there?
So oatmeal, luckily, is still a very healthy food. We have oatmeal right in the front row here, so we'll use it as an example. Do you mind reading on the ingredients list what we have on the ingredients?
100% whole rolled oats.
There's not additives, non-food items, so that would be a green light ahead for me to take home in my shopping cart. So oatmeal is definitely, it's high fiber, it's low fat, and we have a whole food that we recognize. How many of you have heard about carbohydrates as being a bad thing, either just in general or when it comes to blood sugars? Ananda's saying yes. Okay, some of you are saying yes. So carbohydrates do get a bad reputation because especially processed carbohydrates, they do raise the blood sugars. They can also raise some of the fats in our blood, our triglyceride levels. If any of you have talked to your doctor and they say, oh, triglycerides are running high, we really want to watch sugars and refined carbohydrates. But carbohydrates aren't all bad. So they are our body's main energy source. Like we were talking about with the billions of cells in our body, they need carbohydrates. This glucose, our body primarily gets glucose from the carbohydrates that we eat. So if we completely cut carbohydrates out of the picture, we feel pretty sluggish. Our brain doesn't function as well, our bodies, our muscles don't function as well. So while it may be beneficial to reduce how much carbohydrate we're taking in, we never want to go on an incredibly low carbohydrate diet, like an Atkins style plan. That's where we start to get into a little bit trouble because we're cutting out a lot of those high fiber healthy foods. Carbohydrates are not the enemy. They are our body's main energy source. Yes, there are some carbohydrate foods that are better than others, and we're going to go over some of these guys right now. Carbohydrates are found in vegetables like corn, potatoes and sweet potatoes. Peas are another source of carbohydrates in the vegetable world. Grains, our cereals, our breads, our pastas, a lot of times those are the foods that come to mind when we think about carbs. And then our fruits. Fruits are naturally sweet. Yes, they have carbohydrates, they have sugar. Milk, a lot of times people forget that milk, the lactose in milk is sugar. So any of us that are drinking milk on a daily basis, or having a lot of yogurts or dairy products, we're getting some added carbohydrate and added sugar there. And then of course sugars like our candies, our sweets, our baked goods. A lot of times those are the things that first come to mind when we're told that our blood sugars are a little high. Oh, I need to watch things like sodas and juices and sweets. Yes? So all vegetables have carbohydrate, you're absolutely right. But there's starchy vegetables that have a higher amount of starch and carbohydrate, and all the other vegetables we call non-starchy vegetables. And those are our healthiest foods under the sun. So basically every vegetable out there, aside from your corn, your peas, your potatoes, it's green light ahead. We can eat an abundant amount of them while still stabilizing blood sugars and maintaining weight. Not to speak poorly of corn, peas, and potatoes. They're still great, nutritious foods, but when we're watching blood sugars, we want to limit portions of those. So these are our preferred carbohydrates right here. So when it comes to whole grains, and keyword whole, we don't want processed versions of these. We have whole wheat pasta, oatmeal, we had a question about oatmeal, barley, whole grain cereals, brown rice, quinoa. Vegetables, we'd like them raw, steamed, we can do salads, stir fries. And then fruit, we'd like it in its whole form. Again, keywords whole here. So whole instead of dried or fruit juice or canned or sweetened. And keep in mind again, these are minimally processed, these are whole foods, foods we can recognize. These are just some examples here of some changes that we can make. If we typically have rice as a side dish or part of a stir fry or when eating out, let's try quinoa instead. And quinoa luckily is getting more attention. We're going to try it tonight, our recipe from Chef Kyle at the hospital. If you know how to cook rice, you can cook quinoa. I'm sure a lot of people in this room are already eating quinoa or have at least experimented with it. And it's a great substitution for rice and is a nice happy blood sugar food. Instead of doing white pasta, we'd like to transition to whole grain pasta. There are also quinoa pastas out there, lentil pastas. There's a wide variety of alternate pastas where you get more fiber and less of the starch and the sugar. Instead of a sugared, sweetened, processed cereal, oatmeal is a good choice. Even doing quinoa as a warm breakfast cereal, especially as the weather gets a little cooler in the morning. Nice hearty bowl of even oatmeal mixed with quinoa. Oh, it's comfort food in the morning. And then instead of French fries, this is where your baked potatoes, your yams come in, making your own oven fries instead. We save a lot of calories, salt, and gain a lot of fiber that way. And then instead of candy, doing the whole fruit or fruit juice, doing the whole piece of fruit. Sherry? Good question. The question was, is honey bad? So honey it's still a processed food if we think about it. So we're taking the honeycomb and the bees are doing the work, but the bees are processing that into sugar. So we want to limit it. It's not something that we want to eat liberally, but if we're using, say, a small amount as a natural sweetener, it's still safe to use, of course. We get a little more nutrients, B vitamins from honey versus using table sugar.
Do you think the raw one's better?
Raw honey?
Yeah.
That, as far as diabetes control, we want it's the portion size that matters the most versus raw versus organic. So whatever the source of sugar, whether it's table sugar, honey, maple syrup, we've got to limit it across the board because they're all sources of sugar that are going to absorb real quick and can raise our blood sugars really quickly. Okay, so the question was, if we have a sweet craving and we want to add a sweetener to a food, is it better to do honey or something like agave versus an artificial sweetener? And that's a really good question. And there's pros and cons to both. So the artificial sweeteners, there's a wide variety of them. And keyword is artificial. They're not substances that our body's used to. Some people have had neurological issues, gastrointestinal issues from artificial sweeteners. For that reason, I recommend avoiding them. If we do need a natural sweetener, using a very small amount of something like a honey or an agave. But even better is retraining your taste buds to enjoy the natural flavors and natural sweetness in things like fruits. So for oatmeal, if we normally put brown sugar or honey even on oatmeal, trying to mix in a little applesauce or mix in some frozen berries or even some pureed berries or pureed fruit. And experimenting with those kind of things, we can literally retrain our taste buds. So stevia is a really, that's a really good question too. Stevia is one of our sugar substitutes that luckily is natural. It's not an artificial substance. Stevia is a lot sweeter than sugar, so we only need a really small amount compared to if we were going to use sugar. Depending on the brand that we purchase, there can be some additives that we want to be cautious about, some starches that can be added. But if you're buying a pure stevia extract, either liquid or in powder form, it is safe to use as an alternative to sugar. Stevia can have a little bitter aftertaste. Everybody has kind of a different palate, but complaints from some people, especially using it in baking, is that bitter aftertaste. But by all means, it's safe to use. It will not significantly raise the blood sugars. Great questions.
Brown rice.
Okay, yeah, good question. So that always comes up is, you notice I'm going from white rice all the way to quinoa, a whole different food here. Brown rice will give you a little bit extra fiber, but it still tends to raise the blood sugars pretty high because it contains a good quantity of starch. So for that reason, whether it's white rice or brown rice, we have to watch portions for blood sugar control. Go ahead. So the question was, is wild rice better than brown rice, better than white rice? Wild rice is a little bit better. So if we're going from white rice, brown rice is a little bit better, wild rice a little bit better, quinoa is still the better alternative. But with wild rice, we've got a little bit more fiber, a little bit more vitamins and minerals, and the body has to work a little bit harder to break it down and turn it into sugar. So it is a safer alternative. Quinoa, interestingly enough, is actually a seed. So even though a seed. Yeah, so the question was, is quinoa like a wild rice? Quinoa is actually, it actually looks kind of like bird seed when it's in its raw form. And when we cook it, we're going to have it in a moment here. You'll see it kind of opens up, the seed opens up, and it has an interesting texture, kind of a mild nutty flavor, but it works in any recipe where you would use rice. So it's really versatile that way. And it can be mixed into a lot of different recipes. You can make quinoa burger patties out of it as a substitute for a hamburger. You can do it as the warm breakfast cereal. You can put it into baked goods. There's quinoa flours you can use.
And isn't quinoa also very high in protein?
Quinoa is a complete protein. So if any of you are trying to transition to a vegetarian style diet and you're worried about, oh, am I getting the right types of protein or enough protein? Quinoa, yes, we classify it as a grain, but because it's a seed, it's a complete protein source. And that makes it higher in iron, higher in nutrients than our other grains. So it's great for people that are following vegetarian or vegan diets. Question was, what do I think of a raw food diet? Raw food diets, the main challenge there is staying on it. It's a lot of meal preparation. They're nutritionally very complete, amazing diets, but most people, especially if you're working or raising a family or you've got a lot of activities going on, it is hard to comply with it and stay on. So we do encourage eating an abundant amount of raw foods, especially your fruits or vegetables, but you're still going to get tremendous health benefits even if you're doing cooked foods, cooked produce. Chat just a touch here about protein. So as we were talking about quinoa there, a lot of us are thinking we're not getting enough protein. We have this kind of conception as Americans that, we need more, and protein is kind of in that category. Oh, we're not getting enough. Most of us, though, are eating way too much. And when we get too much protein, it can be taxing on our kidneys. It can offset our acid-base balance and actually kind of cause some calcium to be pulled from the bones. So we want to be really careful about how much protein we're taking in, especially if that protein is coming from animal sources, so meat, eggs, dairy. Keep in mind, when we're having a portion of protein, say for lunch or for dinner, we're having a piece of chicken. This is a little chicken breast up here. We're looking for just about a deck of cards as far as thickness and size. And that's going to give us over 1/3 of the amount of protein that we need per day. So we really don't need a huge amount of protein in the diet. Most of us here in this room, unless we're highly active, or doing kind of strenuous exercise, need anywhere between about 40 and 60, 65 grams a day. And this little portion here is about 20, 22 grams. So most of us are overshooting the protein.
Is there a negative side of raw food diet? I keep hearing all this, oh, you can't do that.
No, if your digestive tract is completely healthy and fine, and if you have no risk or no compromise to your immune function, there's no risk. Yes, some of the benefits of when you are cooking food, it does kind of break the food down a little bit and make digestion a little bit easier. So for people that have issues with gas or digestive or malabsorption issues, we don't recommend a lot of raw foods. And people that have compromised immune systems, because there's a little bit more of a risk of bacteria on raw foods when you haven't cooked them, we are cautious about that. So protein, most of us are getting too much. Sherry? Peanut butter does count as a protein. Peanut butter is a tricky one. I'll go ahead here, some of our protein sources. You'll notice that our nuts right here, nuts and seeds are a protein source, but does anyone know why we may want to be a little bit cautious with nuts and seeds? They're high in fat. Since part of preventing diabetes and keeping us out of the high blood sugar woods is weight control, yes, we still want to eat nuts and seeds, but in small amounts. So we don't want to be doing, a big bag of trail mix, a couple times a week. Otherwise, we're getting a lot of extra calories and fat, and then we'll notice, our weight might be creeping up, or we're having trouble bringing the weight down.
And raw nuts have enzyme inhibitors, so you don't eat a lot of raw nuts.
Exactly, very good point. So if we eat a lot of raw nuts, then we can actually inhibit some of the enzymes that we need for digestion and absorption.
So what about soaking them? I've heard that if you soak the raw nuts, then they start to sprout and it
They're more readily available as far as absorption. I don't know as far as the enzyme piece.
Yeah, it does.
Okay, so it would help that.
It does help, yeah, it deactivates.
Perfect. So soaking of raw nuts, good thing. So whether we're using raw nuts, toasted nuts, incorporating nuts into a recipe, or using nut butters like peanut butter, we do want to limit the nuts and seeds. They are a good source of protein, but we want to be cautious because of the high fat content. Some other sources, healthy sources of protein, we have the very lean meats like our skinless chicken and poultry, certain types of fish, especially some of our white fishes like tilapia or rockfish, some of our shellfish. Beans, peas, and lentils are probably the most healthy source of protein under the sun. And as far as preventing diabetes, there's been a lot of research on beans, just beans alone. And even if people are eating kind of the standard American diet, we call it the SAD diet, standard American diet, but if they're eating the standard American diet and adding beans in, changing nothing else but just having a portion of beans 1 or 2 times a day, their diabetes risk, their heart disease risk starts to decline. So I would encourage you in this room is if you're going, I'm not ready to make a huge change to my diet, but you know what, I can eat something extra every day, or I could add something on. Make it be something in the beans, peas, and lentils world.
Okay, a question?
Yes.
You just said that corn, potatoes, and peas were bad too much, and now you've said beans, peas, and lentils are good.
So black-eyed peas, very good question. This would be your black-eyed peas, your split peas.
So you're talking about the little green peas, but that's what you limit, but the dry ones are fine?
Exactly. So dried beans, dried peas, very good question. The question was earlier we were talking about starchy vegetables, including peas, and here we're talking about beans, peas, and lentils being a superfood. So this would be your dried peas, your dried beans, your dried peas, your legumes. And an absolute health food because of their high fiber amount. They slow digestion, so they slow that blood sugar response after a meal. And that's the reason they're really great at diabetes prevention.
I don't know if this is a wise tale or not, but taking a tablespoon of peanut butter is supposed to even out your blood sugar. Have you ever heard?
So yeah, the thought used to be that if somebody was having, their blood sugar was either falling too quickly or raising too quickly, to have some peanut butter. Fat does the same thing that fiber does as far as slowing digestion, but we have some repercussions from the high fat in peanut butter if we eat large amounts of it. And that issue we were talking about where if we start to gain weight from a high fat diet, we get fat accumulating around the cells. The same thing can happen from peanut butter. But if peanut butter, say we're having peanut butter with a piece of toast versus just the toast, our blood sugar will rise slower after the meal and not as high, simply because the fat from the peanut butter slows digestion. Yeah, that's the peanut butter trick.
I'm concerned that almond butter
Uh-huh.
is better for you than the peanut butter.
Depending on the brand, almonds do have yeah, oh gosh, yeah. The price point is a little different. You do get some different nutrients as far as your vitamins, your minerals, a little bit more vitamin E, a little bit more omega-3s from your almonds and almond butter. But as far as the calories and the fat piece, we're pretty much equivalent with the almond butter versus the peanut butter because we're not getting any additives. The answer was, is grinding your own peanut butter or almond butter better? And yes, because we know we're not adding any salt, any sugar, any additional oils. So the question is, other than almonds, what are some other great nut choices? So the nuts that have really good nutrition profiles, pistachios, walnuts, almonds are some of our top guys. And that's just the types of fats, the types of vitamins and minerals that we're getting, and the calorie content. Pistachios, luckily, are a little bit lower per serving with calories. Plus, if you're trying to lose weight, if you have your pistachios in the shell, you have a half cup of shelled pistachios. By the time you get done with them, it's less likely that you're going to overdo it when you're snacking. So I like pistachios for that reason. So we've talked about this already, limiting the high-fat foods for weight loss, and that's regardless of what type of fat it is. So even if it's a healthier fat that we think of, like olive oil, avocado, nuts, seeds, we still want to limit those portions so we don't have that extra fat around our midsection, extra fat around our cells. Saturated fats, these are the guys that tend to increase our risk of heart disease. If we already have high cholesterol, we want to limit these to bring our cholesterol down, and that would be primarily cheese and higher fat dairy products, your fattier meats, and then of course fried foods. We want to be really careful with for that saturated fat piece.
Do you have coconut?
What's that?
Coconut oil?
So coconut oil and coconut milk. Coconut is quite high in saturated fat. They have done some research, though, that's showing that the saturated fat in coconut doesn't raise the bad cholesterol the same as the saturated fats that we have in dairy products or our animal products. I would still be cautious with coconut oil, full-fat coconut milk, simply because we have a high amount of fat, we have a high amount of calories, and it halts the weight loss. But good point is coconut oil, yes, it's higher in saturated fat, but not as high of a risk as far as the heart disease or the raising of the bad cholesterol. So we want to use those oils sparingly. I failed to bring it tonight, but I usually bring my little misto sprayer. Many of you have probably seen one. It's just a little hand pump sprayer. You put your own olive oil or healthy oil in it, and you literally pump it yourself, and it's a little spritzer. And it's kind of a homemade version of the PAM spray that you see in the store. And it helps because you can easily coat the pan with just a touch of oil instead of having to pour or drizzle and then get a lot of extra fat and calories that way. So the misto sprayer here in town, I think you can still get them at ER Energy next to Safeway there. Okay, so usually at this point we kind of pass the food around and we walk through the label. We have some pretty good time right now, so I think we'll do a couple examples. But food labels, there's a lot on the label and it's overwhelming. And even for myself, when I head to the grocery store, if you're not really kind of a detective and looking at all the parts of the label, we miss things. We see additives that are in foods that we didn't realize were there, or we didn't realize that what we thought was just a package of oatmeal has 20 different ingredients, half of which we can't pronounce. So we want to at least get in tune with what's important on the label and what to look for. So there's a lot of claims on the front of the box: organic, fat-free, heart-healthy. We automatically, regardless of what the product is, we want to flip it over and look at the nutrition facts label and the ingredients. And that's ultimately what's going to tell us if it's something that we want to be putting in our bodies. Again, regardless of the claims on the front of the package, turn that package over. So as far as the nutrition facts label, and we're once again in the process of revising the label, but This is kind of an older version of a label. Where we always want to start is up at the top with the serving size. But we start at the serving size at the very top of the label, and we want to look at it and see, am I going to eat that portion, or am I going to eat maybe double that, or sometimes even triple that, if it's something like ice cream. I don't know about you guys, but a half a cup is not a portion of ice cream for me. So in this case, the serving size is 1 cup. My beans, the serving size is half a cup. Half a cup of beans, pretty good as a side dish. I might have a little bit more than that, but I think that's reasonable. So then we come down here and we're going to look at the calories. And if we're trying to lose weight, what are we looking for? Higher number, lower number for calories? Lower. In this case, we'll use the beans as an example. We've got half of a cup, 80 calories. Not a big drop in the bucket. I'm still feeling pretty good about my can of beans here. Next, we come down here, and this is our kind of heart health zone where we really want to glance at. Saturated fat, the cholesterol, and the sodium, these 3 right here, we want to look for less than 10% of our daily value. And that's what I've found over the years is kind of the quickest way to glance at a label and see if it's something that we're going to take home that's heart healthy or not. Is glance down here, and if these guys are under 10%, probably green light ahead. I'm looking at my beans here. I've got 0% saturated fat, no trans fat, no cholesterol, but my sodium, we're in a can, my sodium's 11%. So I have a little red flag because my sodium's jumping up above 10%. Now there's good stuff. That's the stuff that we want to limit, but there's good stuff on the label that we want more of. And the main one that I look at is fiber. So with our dietary fiber, a food like this that's got a big fat 0 is a red flag for me, because I know either it's been highly processed and the fiber's been stripped from that food, or it's maybe an animal product like yogurt that isn't necessarily a horrible food, but it doesn't have any fiber naturally. So I know that if that's a 0, either I'm going to swap it out for something else, or I'm going to add a high fiber food to that item to complement my meal. So fiber, I look for at least 3 grams of fiber per serving. If I go back to my beans here, I've got 5 grams in my half cup serving. So in this case, beans, the other thing we didn't talk about is price. Beans luckily are cheap. So I would say, hey, I'm taking it home. Even better though is, and cheaper, is our 1 pound bag of dried beans, where boom, we move the sodium down, we move the price down, and we get a bigger portion.
And what about soaking beans? Are you supposed to soak beans? I mean, is there something in there that's not?
Yeah, there's something called the type of starch in beans. It's called resistant starch, and that's why we get gassy from beans, because our body literally has trouble breaking it down. The benefit of that, though, is that resistant starch, because it's not broken down, it doesn't convert as readily into sugar like our other starches do. Another reason why beans are such a health food. Soaking the beans can help release some of that resistant starch. So if you soak them and then rinse them, you get rid of some of that resistant starch. And if you have that gassy issue, the longer you soak, you tend to have less gas. Also, the longer that you cook them, less gas. So this is this is very basic as far as the label. There's a lot of other portions to the label, but those are kind of the things, if we're trying to cruise through the grocery store and decide if we're going to take that item home or not, those are kind of the things that we want to be keyed into. Does anyone want to use a sample item that they have? I don't want to put anyone on the spot, but if anyone wants to share with one of the items that I passed around.
Well, I noticed the oatmeal has 16% fiber and it's circled on there.
Great, okay, yes, so, and how many grams of fiber? We were talking about 3 grams or more? 4. So yeah, we hit our fiber goal. And how about saturated fat, cholesterol, and sodium on the oatmeal?
0.5.
Nice, so nice and low. Our percentage is under 10%, so oatmeal is a green light ahead. Some of your favorite foods, maybe that usually you automatically throw into your basket every week when you're shopping, is maybe take a peek at some of those, or when you go home tonight, take a peek and see if they pass the test. And if not, when you run out and you're going back to the store, is think about swapping it out for something that maybe does pass the test. And right now we're passing around our recipe from Chef Kyle at Howard Memorial Kitchen, and we have it portioned out for you. Speaking of portions here, but But it's our quinoa. Those of you that haven't tried quinoa or aren't familiar with it, we have this quinoa bean salad. So we're incorporating two of our biggest superfoods, the quinoa and the beans together, into kind of an entree salad, or you can do it as a side dish. Yeah, Sherry was saying it kind of has the texture of couscous, but the good news is that with quinoa, couscous is more processed. So it doesn't have as much fiber, protein, or nutrients. We get all those, though, with the quinoa. So it's a good couscous substitute, too. So really quickly on portions, I think we all know that most of our portion sizes of processed foods, restaurant foods, tend to be way bigger than what we should be eating. Fortunately, though, if we're eating more whole foods, and if we're focusing on the whole foods that aren't the high-fat foods, we're automatically cutting calories even if portions are bigger. Anytime, though, that we're eating grains, including the quinoa, or things like our proteins or packaged foods, we really want to keep an eye on portions. So if we're talking pasta or rice, about a half a cup, which is kind of like your cupped hand. If we're talking a cup of vegetables or a piece of fruit, kind of your closed fist is a good way to eyeball it. If we're talking about the protein portions, we mentioned deck of cards, but also your palm without the fingers is about the portion that we're looking for meats. And if you think of what we get sometimes typically at restaurants, sometimes it can be double or even triple that. You know, think of some of the steaks at the broiler or even the chicken breasts, if we're eating a meal out, can be, you know, at least 2 times what we should be eating. So I always encourage the to-go box or order extra vegetables, and you can do an abundant amount of your salad greens, your vegetables, and still stay low calorie, low fat when we're watching the toppings. Speaking of toppings, with our condiments, things like butter or margarine spread, 1 tablespoon is kind of the tip of your thumb there. So 2 tablespoons if we're talking salad dressing, not a whole lot, 2 tips of the thumb. So spices, how many of you have been cautioned to limit your salt intake, either because of blood pressure or heart disease? Okay, yeah, lots of us. Fluid retention too. So if we use spices, we're talking fresh herbs, spices. Look on the ingredients list too, though, and make sure, even if it's a spice blend, it's a beautiful organic spice blend, there may be some salt added. So, you know, look on those spice blends, make sure it is just herbs, just spices. And these are great alternatives to using salt in our recipes at home.
So I've been hearing a lot about the difference between salts.
Mm-hmm.
Some salt is like the sea salt that you have seen the pictures of the boat.
Larger granules.
Yeah, and so that you actually need that. So anyway, I'm confused about the salt.
No, yeah, salt is confusing, just like the different types of sugar or sweeteners. You know, do I use honey? Do I use agave? Do I use table sugar? With salts, there is a wide variety, and it's kind of the same argument, where if we're using sea salt, Himalayan salt, we do get a wider amount of nutrients. So we might get a little more iodine, we might get some micronutrients, some minerals, but the actual sodium content, we still want to limit. The benefit, though, if we have something like a sea salt or Himalayan salt, the granules are bigger, and so sometimes we need less because it's a stronger flavor. Or we just sprinkle, Chef Kyle does this a lot, is he won't incorporate any of the salt into the recipe sometimes, but he'll just sprinkle a little bit on the top, just a touch, so you get that, you know, that flavor when you take, you know, your first or second bite. That can be another little trick. But this recipe, you'll notice it has some citrus in it. So citrus zest and citrus juice, that's another good trick in addition to spices and herbs to really kind of blossom that flavor and bring more flavor into your meals without needing a lot of salt. Okay, so this is always the big question, is what if I fall off the wagon? What do I do? You know, I went out to eat, I went overboard, or, you know, I went to the buffet at the casino. What do I do? These things happen. So if we overeat, of course, we're not going to beat ourselves up. We're not going to throw in the towel and go, oh, geez, I fell off the wagon at lunch. Forget the rest of the day. I might as well go out for pizza and ice cream. If we overeat, we forgive ourselves. That's the first thing. Don't beat yourselves up. But that's the time when we want to go out, and we don't have to do strenuous exercise, but if we've overeaten, please go out for at least some kind of a walk. Because believe it or not, as we're digesting and that blood sugar is starting to rise after that meal, we can blunt that blood sugar response if we're at least doing something kind of active. And that can be as simple as, that's why I have my little weights over here. Say you ate a big meal and you're too tired to even go out for a walk because you got lethargic because you ate so much. So you're sitting there watching Jeopardy after dinner because you're so full. Have a little pair of hand weights or 2 cans of your canned beans or your soup, and lift some weights while you're watching your 30-minute television program. And believe it or not, you could even, those of you that are testing your blood sugars at home, if you test your blood sugar before you do that little bit of exercise and after, it can be, a huge drop. I use myself as a guinea pig a lot at home, and I'm calling myself out here, but I had a cookie from Shots, I admit it, down in Ukiah, and I knew my blood sugar was running a little bit high, and I tested it, and it was. So my husband was laughing at me, but I said I need to lift some weights. So just 10 minutes, light weights in the living room, 10 minutes, and my blood sugars dropped 50 points in 10 minutes. So I would encourage you to test yourself. If your blood sugars tend to run high after a certain meal, for a lot of us it's dinner, we tend to eat a little bit more at dinner, go for even a 10 or 15-minute walk or do something active, house cleaning even, something active for 10, 15 minutes after that meal. So the question was, so if we're struggling with weight loss but we're still really active, do we have an issue with our metabolism? And there are a handful of people that have a low thyroid function, hypothyroidism. If you haven't had that checked, you could talk to your physician about checking it. But a lot of times we don't realize how calories sneak into the diet. And that's what I work a lot with people about is we do food journaling. We look really closely at how much are we taking in, and are there things that are sneaking in? Maybe it's a beverage. Maybe we have hot chocolate in the morning and we're not thinking of that as being extra calories. Or, we have that little handful of trail mix in the afternoon and we don't realize that handful might be 300 extra calories. And that's why our weight isn't coming down. And Sherry, I'm not saying that's what's happening with you, but sometimes it... Yeah, and okay, so yeah, if we skip meals, sometimes if we skip meals, it throws our body off, and then our body isn't digesting and metabolizing the food as efficiently. So it all kind of goes into being consistent with what you're eating and when you're eating, helps blood sugar levels, helps weight management and your energy and your sanity too. So we'll simplify things. I know I'm running out of time, so I want to make sure we at least talk about the meal planning piece. This is kind of our simplest way that we can build our plates, whether we're eating out or eating at home, is we want half of that plate to be the non-starchy vegetables. So this is any vegetable except the corn, the peas, the potatoes. And load that up. It can even be more than half the plate, but we want at least half the plate of those great non-starchy vegetables. Only about a quarter or a touch more of that plate is going to be protein. We'd like it to be lean protein or a protein alternative. So this can be your lean meat. This could be an additional amount of beans. This could be tofu. This could be your fish. It could be some chicken. But make sure that we're just doing about a quarter of the plate. And then notice the starch is also only about a quarter of the plate, or for some people that are really starch sensitive, we may have to go to a little less than a quarter of the plate. If we choose those high fiber starches though that we were talking about, if instead of a white potato, if we did our quinoa there, most likely, nine times out of 10, we can do a little bit larger portion and still keep blood sugar steady. So there's a lot to say as far as the type of carbohydrate that we're doing. So we want those high fiber whole food starches. So more examples of what we should eat. Again, the key word whole. So whole grains, whole wheat pastas, the quinoa, oatmeal, barley, the whole grain cereals, or the brown rice. The vegetables, we'll take them how we can get them. Raw, steamed, in a little stir fry, in a salad, in a smoothie. And then whole fruit also. We want it whole whenever possible. So fresh or frozen, even at the dollar store. A lot of people that I work with, we're pinching pennies, if I can say that right. And the dollar store even, we can get unsweetened frozen fruit that we can incorporate into oatmeal, that we can incorporate into a smoothie or have as a side dish. So a lot of times that's the more cost-effective way to have fruit, is doing the frozen route. And then definitely keeping it unsweetened. Watch those labels. If you're buying a bag of fruit or something in the frozen aisle, make sure we have no added sweeteners or added salt. So lean poultry, as far as our protein world, our lean fish we talked about, lean meats, some soy foods. And the reason it's some soy foods is you've probably heard a lot about genetic modification of foods, and I won't go on a tangent there, but with soy foods, a lot of them are genetically modified. So if we are going to purchase soy foods, I would encourage you to purchase organic forms. And with soy foods too, if they've been highly processed, so a lot of the soy foods in the freezer aisle, some of the Morningstar Farm brands or the Garden Burger brands, you'll notice the salt content and sometimes the fat content can be quite high because they're adding the salt as a preservative and for a little bit extra flavor. So do watch that with the processed soy products. And of course, beans and our legumes down there in that picture, absolute superfoods. So kind of the more the merrier. Try to add those into at least a meal a day as a starting point. Okay, we can do some non-fat dairy, or even better if we can do dairy alternatives. So if you've tried almond milk, coconut milk, some unsweetened soy milks, those can be a lot more blood sugar friendly because we're avoiding the lactose. And then our healthy fats, so the nuts, the seeds, the avocado, we want to do small amounts of these, even smaller amounts if we're really trying to bring the weight down and watch our waistline. Alcohol, I'm going to have to go through kind of quickly here. But alcohol, it doesn't directly raise or lower blood sugar, but anyone know what organ is responsible for dealing with alcohol, metabolizing it? The liver, okay. The liver also plays a role in keeping our blood sugar steady. So if we've been drinking a lot, our liver is busy trying to metabolize the alcohol, it can't help keep our blood sugar steady. So we've had people come into the hospital where they've had a dangerously low blood sugar because they were drinking and they weren't eating, and the blood sugar dropped because the liver couldn't help compensate that. So we want to make sure that if you are drinking alcohol, that we limit it. And if you are monitoring your blood sugars, and especially if you're taking a diabetes medication, that you never have any portion of alcohol on an empty stomach. Always have just a small amount and with a meal. But we definitely want to limit it as much as possible. So the doctor of the future will no longer treat the human frame with drugs, but rather will cure and prevent disease with nutrition. So I kind of like that quote. It's one that still holds true. And we really want to think of food as medicine, and think of that every time we're sitting down, to have a bite or a drink or an actual meal. So thank you all for having me here tonight. We have time for some questions if any of you have questions, or I'm available for a little bit afterwards. But again, thank you for sharing your evening with me, and I hope you learned a little bit tonight about nutrition and diabetes prevention. Thank you. Thank you.